An aging Army medic sits alone in a quiet southern diner, nursing black coffee and memories she spent years trying to forget. But when a reserved young waitress refills her cup, a flash of ink beneath a rolled sleeve freezes her in place. The same tattoo worn by a unit Helen Cartwright thought died with them overseas. Who is this woman, and how could she possibly carry the mark of the fallen? What unspoken bond ties them together across years, distance? Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story might just be the one that hits even closer to home. Helen Cartwright didn't flinch when the bell above the diner door jingled. She didn't look up when the kitchen clattered with plates, or when the younger patrons laughed too loud in the corner booth. Her focus stayed locked on the porcelain mug between her fingers. Half empty, not quite cold, just the way she liked it. She sat in the same seat every morning, third stool from the left, where the wall mirror gave her a clean view of both the door and the parking lot outside. A habit, yes, but not just from routine. It was muscle memory born from places where exits mattered more than entrances. Helen's face didn't reveal much. Short, gray-blonde hair, clean-cut with a precision that lingered from decades of military discipline. She wore a brown leather jacket, even in July, zipped halfway up with a silver pendant peeking out just below the collar. Her eyes steely, sharp. Didn't miss much even when she pretended not to be looking. The waitress came into view like clockwork. She moved softly, like someone trained to vanish in plain sight. Her name tag read Grace, written in fading black marker on a strip of white tape. She never said more than she had to, never asked questions, never offered small talk. Helen noticed that first. The silence. The girl couldn't have been more than 27, but she had the eyes of someone who'd seen too much. She was tall, but walked as if she were trying to shrink herself. Always in long sleeves, even in the summer heat. Her dark brown hair was usually pulled back, tucked beneath a cap or a braid, not one tattoo visible. Until today. As Grace reached across the counter to refill Helen's coffee, her sleeve caught on the corner of the napkin holder. It tugged just enough for the fabric to slide up her wrist. Just 2 inches. But that was enough. Helen's eyes snapped to the ink like a reflex. Her fingers stiffened around the mug. It was a raven, wings unfurled, claws out, curled into the number 3. A circle of thorns wrapped around its body. She knew it instantly. 13th Recon, Echo Unit. Her unit. That mark didn't exist in civilian tattoo parlors. That image had been designed in the Kunar province by a squad of 12 soldiers who hadn't all made it home. Some had died. Others had simply disappeared, swallowed by fire and bureaucracy. And then there was Sam. Helen's throat tightened. Grace didn't notice the stare. She had already turned, disappearing toward a booth where a trucker was flagging her down with an empty glass. Helen blinked, trying to pull herself back, but the tremble in her hand betrayed her. She set the mug down carefully, wiping her palms on her jeans beneath the counter. Her heart thudded a little too fast for a woman just drinking coffee. No one had worn that mark since 2010. No one outside the unit even knew what it meant. There'd never been public acknowledgement, never an article, never a press release. Operation Ghost Lantern was buried in redacted reports, the kind they don't even let the families read. So how the hell did this waitress have that symbol on her skin? Charlie Bennett, 2 stools down, noticed Helen's sudden stiffness. He was a retired Navy man, Vietnam era, with a limp that came and went depending on the humidity. He leaned slightly, not enough to be obvious. "You good, Cartwright?" Helen didn't answer right away. Her gaze tracked Grace as she refilled sugar dispensers along the counter. Sleeve tugged back into place now, no sign of the ink. "Fine," Helen said, but it came out hoarse. Charlie didn't press her. He knew better. He sipped his coffee and went back to flipping through yesterday's newspaper like nothing had happened. Helen sat a little straighter. Her mind had already gone back there, Back to the desert, back to the night the convoy was ambushed, the moment she realized they weren't getting air support. She could still hear Sam's voice, shouting over the crackle of radio static, calling out positions. Then silence. The kind of silence that follows a final breath. She closed her eyes for half a second. It couldn't be a coincidence. Grace returned to the counter, dropping a check near Charlie and offering him a quick nod. Helen studied her again, her posture, her gait, the way her eyes scanned the room without turning her head. That was trained. That wasn't something a waitress picked up slinging hash browns in a small-town diner. There was something else, too. A sadness behind Grace's face, like a page permanently dog-eared at the worst part of the story. Helen had seen that before, in soldiers who didn't get to come home, and in those who did but didn't know how to stay. She didn't ask. Not yet. Instead, Helen left cash under the edge of her plate and slid off the stool. Her boots hit the floor with a heavy thud. She nodded once to Charlie and walked toward the door, passing Grace just as she reached for the pot of fresh brew. "You served?" Helen asked, her voice low. Grace blinked, caught off guard. "Sorry?" Helen gestured lightly toward Grace's wrist. "That tattoo. You earn it?" Grace's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Her fingers twitched, just barely. "I should go," she said quickly, turning away. "My shift's not over." Helen watched her retreat. She didn't press. Not yet. She pushed open the door, the bell chiming overhead. Sunlight hit her eyes, and she winced slightly before adjusting her jacket collar and heading toward her truck. But that image stayed in her head, etched and undeniable. The raven, the number 3, the circle of thorns. It wasn't just some design. It was a ghost. The kind that didn't let go. Not without answers. Not without justice. Back inside the diner, Grace stood at the sink, staring down at her hands. The one with the tattoo trembled slightly as the hot water ran over it. She should have been more careful. Should have worn the wristband. But sometimes the past doesn't wait for permission. Sometimes it finds you in the third stool from the left, under a flickering light, holding a cup of black coffee with eyes that see straight through you. And now that it had found her, she knew the quiet wouldn't last much longer. Helen Cartwright wasn't the type to chase ghosts. At least, that's what she told herself as she drove the back roads toward home, her knuckles white around the steering wheel. The sun sliced through the trees in flashes, rhythmically lighting up her dashboard like a strobe. Each beam was a beat, and with every beat, her thoughts circled back to the ink. That damn tattoo, the wings, the number, the circle. 13. Echo. It had been years since she'd spoken that phrase aloud. Years since she allowed herself to look back for too long. That mark belonged to people who were now folded into her memory like burnt pages, charred, unreadable, final. Yet here she was, seeing it again, alive on someone else's skin. She took the long way home, not because of the scenery, but because she needed time. She needed distance. Her truck's cab felt too small for the thoughts pressing against her skull. By the time she pulled into the gravel driveway, the sun had started to dip behind the pine trees. The porch steps creaked under her boots as she walked into the house she had lived in alone for the past decade. No welcome mat, no dog barking, just silence, broken only by the metallic click of her keys hitting the bowl by the door. She didn't turn on the lights. She walked into the kitchen and opened the cupboard above the sink, pulling down a metal tin covered in stickers, dents, and dust. The kind of container people used to store cookies in, but veterans like Helen used for war. Inside were patches, pins, folded photos, a laminated copy of a Bronze Star commendation, and, buried beneath them all, a creased, sun-faded piece of paper with the names of her unit, all 12 of them. She ran her fingers over each name, stopping on one. Staff Sergeant Samuel Blake. Sam had been the youngest of the group. Sharp, fearless, maybe too fearless. He had drawn the unit tattoo one night on a napkin, passing it around between missions as a joke. But when they got back to base, 3 of them actually got it inked in a dusty makeshift shop behind a barber tent. Helen never did. She said it was bad luck to tattoo a ghost onto your own skin. Sam didn't care. Better to carry them with you, he said. And now, that same ghost was etched into the wrist of a waitress in a backwoods diner, 12 years and 2,000 miles away from the Kunar Valley. Helen folded the paper back up and slid the tin back into the cupboard. Not tonight. She didn't have it in her to fall into the past. Not yet. But tomorrow she'd go back. Grace Mitchell moved quietly in her upstairs room above the diner. The floor creaked, but she knew where not to step. She kept the curtains drawn, not out of paranoia but habit. She hadn't had a real home in years. Not since she left what was left of her family behind in Missouri, carrying only a duffel bag and a letter she couldn't bring herself to throw away. The letters sat in her nightstand, so did the dog tags. She undressed slowly, folding her uniform neatly and placing it on the chair by the window. Her wrist was bare now, the tattoo exposed. She stared at it. Not the design, but the skin around it. The memory beneath it. The night she watched her uncle disappear into smoke and shouted radio calls. The day they told her he was missing, presumed dead. They never sent a body. Just a flag, and that damned letter. Grace rubbed the inside of her wrist. She hadn't meant to reveal it today. She was usually so careful. But something about that older woman, the way she looked at her, like she knew, it had knocked Grace off balance. She'd seen that look once before, in the mirror after she read the casualty list. Helen had returned to the diner before dawn. Tina, the owner, was just unlocking the front door when she saw the familiar truck pull in. She raised a brow, but said nothing. Helen wasn't the chatty type, and Tina had long since learned not to poke sleeping bears, especially those that wore combat boots and carried a silence like a blade. Helen waited until the breakfast crowd had come and gone. She nursed her coffee, her eyes fixed on the counter. Grace didn't show. Not during the morning shift. Charlie dropped into the seat beside her sometime around 10. "You're looking for her," he said, not asking. Helen didn't answer. Charlie chuckled, slow and gravelly. "You're not subtle, Cartwright. You think I didn't see you freeze up yesterday?" Helen's fingers curled around her cup. "You ever seen someone carrying a ghost, Charlie?" Charlie scratched his chin. "Every time I look in the mirror." Helen glanced at him, then nodded once. "She had a tattoo," she finally said. Charlie leaned forward, elbows on the counter. "Yeah?" It wasn't random. It was military, specific. "Ours." Charlie whistled low. "You sure?" Helen's jaw clenched. "Dead sure." Charlie went quiet for a moment, then leaned back. "Well, looks like you've got some digging to do." Helen didn't reply, but she didn't need to. She was already turning it over in her mind. The questions, the probabilities, the impossibilities. That mark had no business being on Grace Mitchell's wrist, unless she was family, or one of them, or both. Later that afternoon, Helen waited until the lunch rush had died down and walked around the back of the diner. She stood beneath the rusting fire escape and looked up. A light was on in the small upstairs apartment. She knocked once against the metal railing. Not loud, just enough. Grace opened the window. Their eyes met. No barrier this time, no counter, no sleeve to hide behind. "You want to come up?" Grace asked, barely audible. Helen nodded. Inside the apartment, the air was warm and still, sparse. Lived in, but with the restraint of someone who never meant to stay. A sleeping bag on the floor, a folding chair, a battered bookshelf with 2 dog-eared paperbacks, a single photograph taped to the wall, a young man in uniform squinting into desert sunlight. Helen stared at it for a long time. "Sam," she said quietly. Grace nodded. "My uncle." Helen turned slowly. Her voice wasn't sharp anymore. Feeling. "He saved my life." Grace swallowed. "They said he was gone." Helen looked down. He was. And just like that, the air changed. The silence shifted. Not empty, but full. Full of the weight both of them had been dragging through the years. Neither woman said another word for a while. There was no need. In the room above the diner, with coffee cooling in the mugs they didn't drink from, they sat across from one another. Not as strangers anymore, but as the last echoes of a unit the world had forgotten. And somewhere beneath all that quiet, the story began to stir. The nights were always the hardest. That's when the mind stopped pretending. Helen sat in the dim corner of her living room, boots still on, coat draped over the back of a kitchen chair. The house smelled faintly of cedar and old coffee, a scent she never tried to change. It reminded her of the tent base in Nangalam, where pine smoke and stale brew mixed with dust and diesel. That had been the last place she saw them all together. Sam, Mackie, Lopez, the rest. That was before the convoy, before the silence on the other end of the radio, before the government called it an error in tracking and closed the file. Helen didn't need files. She had memory. And now she had a waitress with Sam Blake's blood and Sam Blake's tattoo. Grace hadn't spoken much after revealing who she was. Helen didn't push. Some things weren't ready to be spoken aloud, not even after years. But the moment in that small upstairs room stayed with Helen, like the lingering thrum of a distant drumbeat. It wasn't just the picture of Sam or the dog tag she'd seen looped on a nail above the window frame. It was the way Grace held herself, like someone who had already buried too much, too young. And Helen knew that weight, knew what it did to people. At midnight she pulled out the tin again, the one with the names and the old letters. She hadn't touched the letter from Sam's mother in years. It was dated 6 months after the MIA declaration, addressed to anyone still breathing who served beside my son. Inside, scrawled in faint blue ink, were just 4 sentences. He believed in something bigger than himself. He trusted the ones beside him. If he didn't come back, I hope one of you made it. That's enough for me. Helen read it 3 times before folding it back up. Grace was more than Sam's niece. She was a link. A line that hadn't been severed completely. A reminder that maybe, just maybe, it hadn't all been for nothing. Back at the diner the next day, the pace was slow. A midweek lull. Local sheriff's deputy Dan Keener sat at the far booth, sipping orange soda and flipping through a hunting magazine. Tina restocked the condiments without looking up. The air buzzed with the low hum of an old jukebox playing Conway Twitty. Grace moved quietly between tables, head down, sleeves tugged tight. She hadn't spoken to Helen since that night. Helen sat in her usual place, hands folded on the counter, watching. Not intrusively, just enough. She'd been trained to observe patterns, body language, routine, deviations. Grace had the marks of someone trained too, even if she didn't know it. Her scanning habits, her methodical steps, the way she always kept a line of sight to the front entrance. She reminded Helen of a scout or someone trained by one. When Grace came to refill her coffee, Helen spoke. "Did Sam raise you?" Grace paused. "Sort of." Helen looked up. "Sort of." Grace chewed the inside of her cheek, then glanced at the few lingering customers before speaking. "I was 12 when he left for his final deployment. He used to send letters and voice recordings. I kept all of them." Helen nodded slowly. "What happened after?" "My mom spiraled. She was never the same after the letter came. Grace's eyes flicked toward the back kitchen door, like she wanted to disappear through it. She remarried fast. I didn't stick around. The military? No. Private NGO, medical logistics. I worked in transport during the Syrian corridor evacuations, ran comms. Sam would have left. I was always terrified of bugs and sand, but I signed up anyway. I needed to know. Helen's voice was soft now. Know what? If they lied, if he was still out there. Silence. Grace looked away. Turns out he wasn't. Helen didn't correct her. She couldn't. Not without proof. But her gut said something else. Too many details from that last mission had never lined up. Too many questions had been left to rot. The door chimed behind them as someone walked in. Ricky Lane, mid-20s, local mechanics kid, and a perpetual source of annoyance. His boots clomped across the tile as he made a beeline for the counter, snapping his gum like he wanted everyone to hear it. "Morning, Grace," he said, sliding onto the stool 2 down from Helen. "Got any of that sugar left, or did you use it all for your arm candy?" Grace didn't answer. She grabbed a rag and wiped down the far end of the counter. Ricky leaned in, his voice low but loud enough. "Saw you last week when your sleeve rolled up. Nice ink. Didn't think the army gave tramp stamps now." Helen stood. Not fast, not theatrical. Just enough. Her eyes locked onto Ricky's, who now had the decency to look mildly uncomfortable. "You ever earn anything in your life, Ricky?" she asked, voice flat. Ricky scoffed, masking his nerves. "I work, don't I?" Helen took a step forward. "Working under a hood isn't the same as bleeding for your country. That mark she wears? It means something. So unless you've got a story written in your bones and sand in your lungs, I suggest you shut up and show some respect." Ricky glanced around, suddenly aware of the silence in the diner. Deputy Keener had looked up from his magazine. Even Tina had stopped organizing mustard packets. Ricky mumbled something about just joking and made for the door, the bell jingling a little more desperately than usual as he left. Grace stood frozen, the rag clenched tightly in her hands. Helen returned to her stool, picked up her mug, and took a long sip. She didn't look at Grace, not right away. But Grace spoke first. "Why'd you do that?" Helen set her cup down. "Because I've seen too many people spit on what they don't understand. I won't sit by and let them do it to someone who's earned the right to be here." Grace's voice was quiet. "Most people just assume I'm trouble. That's because they're looking with the wrong eyes." Grace blinked, something loosening in her chest. "You really think Sam saved your life?" Helen turned to her fully now, her eyes sharp, clear, unwavering. "No, I know he did." That night, Grace sat by her window, legs pulled to her chest, laptop open. She opened a folder marked Sam. Inside were voice notes, faded emails, and an audio file she hadn't touched in years. She clicked play. Sam's voice crackled through the tiny speaker. Calm, steady, a touch of humor woven beneath the steel. "If you're hearing this, then, yeah. Things didn't go the way I wanted, but don't let them forget. Not me. Not Helen. Not the others. We were there. We mattered. And someone needs to remember why." Grace closed the laptop, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Outside, the wind picked up, a soft howl through the pines. And somewhere in the darkness, 2 stories, one old, one just beginning, began to thread themselves into something neither woman had expected. A reckoning. The first comment came from the woman at the laundromat, not loud enough to start a fight, but just clear enough to carry through the sound of spinning dryers. "She's got that look," the woman said, folding a pair of children's jeans. "The kind of girl who disappears for years, then shows back up with ink and a fake name." The man she was talking to grunted but didn't argue. Grace didn't respond. She stood near the end of the row, headphones in but no music playing. The white noise of gossip had become part of her routine ever since she arrived in Kingswood. It didn't bother her like it used to. At least, that's what she told herself. That if you kept your head down long enough, the whispers would run out of steam and latch on to someone else. But this was different. This time, the whispers were circling closer, like a noose tightening around the throat of the life she'd built, however fragile it was. Helen heard about it from Tina. She didn't say anything, Tina told her, wiping down a booth, but Grace was pale all morning, hands shaking, barely touched her food before the shift. Helen didn't say much in return, just gave a quiet nod and left cash for her coffee, then walked outside into the biting wind. The town of Kingswood was small enough that everybody knew everybody, but just big enough to pretend they didn't. People held on to their impressions like family heirlooms. Once they labeled someone, especially a quiet young woman with a locked past and inked skin, they never fully let it go. By the time Helen reached the side alley where Grace usually took her 5-minute breaks, the girl was already there, arms folded, eyes scanning the trees. "You okay?" Helen asked. Grace didn't jump. She never startled easily. "I'm fine," she said automatically, then added, "No, not really." Helen leaned against the brick wall beside her, arms crossed over her chest. "Someone give you a hard time?" Grace hesitated, then shook her head. "No one specific, just... the air feels heavier lately, like people are waiting for me to prove them right." Helen nodded slowly. "They're not your judge." Grace gave a humorless laugh. "Maybe not, but they act like they've already delivered the sentence." Helen looked out at the horizon, where the tree line met the edge of the empty highway. She could remember that same feeling. When she'd come back from Iraq in 2011, half her town treated her like a glass grenade, dangerous and delicate. The rest didn't look at her at all. It wasn't outright disrespect, it was avoidance, as if what she'd seen might be contagious. "Let them look," Helen said. "Staring's easier than understanding." Grace didn't answer. Her eyes stayed on the trees. "I don't think I ever told you," she said quietly. "But after the letter came, the one that said Sam was MIA, I waited by the radio every night, for almost a year, just in case he tried to reach out." Helen looked over, jaw tight. "I kept a notebook," Grace continued. "Wrote down static bursts, timestamps. Tried to decode background noise, like if I just listened hard enough I could pull his voice out of the dark." Helen said nothing, but she reached into her jacket pocket and slowly pulled out a dog-eared slip of paper. It was folded so many times it looked like a fallen leaf. Grace unfolded it, brow furrowing. On it were columns of names, unit numbers, coordinates. One circled in red. 13th Recon, last radio ping, 30, 4DG 5718 L71 DG 27 4E. Status, unconfirmed. "I requested the report a dozen times," Helen said. "Got stonewalled every time. They said it was an equipment malfunction, GPS error, all conveniently vague." Grace's hands trembled slightly as she held the paper. "So he could have..." Helen stopped her with a glance. "We don't know, that's the point, but someone made sure no one would know." That night, Grace didn't go back to her room above the diner. She walked. Long stretches through the outer edge of Kingswood, where homes thinned into fields, and the stars looked like freckles scattered across the sky. She passed the old war memorial on the corner of Main and Copper Street, a bronze statue of a generic soldier holding a rifle, eyes fixed on some invisible horizon. Below it, a plaque read, "To those who served, to those who fell, to those we forgot." She stopped there for a long time. Later, back in her room, she sat cross-legged on the floor and pulled out a shoebox she hadn't opened in months. Inside were Sam's letters, brittle from folding, stained at the edges but still sharp in tone. There was always a joke, always a sentence about coming home, and always a word of advice tucked like a secret under the rest. One read, "Kid, if I don't come back, you don't disappear. You hear me? You go live the hell out of this life. That's your only mission." Grace placed the letter beside her and stared at the wall. She wasn't sure if she'd followed that order or failed it. At the diner the next day, things boiled over. Ricky Lane returned, this time with his girlfriend, a sharp-tongued redhead named Tanya, who enjoyed confrontation a little too much. They sat at the corner booth, laughing loud enough to make people uncomfortable, eyes darting toward Grace every few minutes. When Grace brought their order, Tanya looked her up and down and said, "Didn't know they let you serve food with a criminal record." Ricky grinned. Grace didn't flinch. She simply placed the ketchup on the table and turned to leave. Tanya wasn't finished. "Wait. Is it true what people are saying? You went AWOL from some base overseas? That what the ink's for?" Helen was out of her seat before Grace could open her mouth. She crossed the diner with the steadiness of a woman who had nothing left to prove and everything left to protect. "You got something to say about soldiers? Say it to me," Helen said, her voice low and controlled. Tanya raised her chin. "Didn't say anything untrue." "No?" Helen took a step closer. "Then let me educate you." The room had gone still. Even the coffee machine had fallen silent, like the building itself held its breath. "Having that girl over there, she's done more in her short life than most people ever will. She's served, sacrificed. She's carried more loss than you could wrap your mind around on your best day. And if you think mocking her makes you brave, I hate to break it to you, but all you're doing is proving how small you really are." Ricky stood halfway, chest puffed, but Keener, the deputy, appeared from his usual spot in the corner with one slow shake of his head. "Sit down, Rick," he said, "before you get real familiar with the sidewalk." Ricky obeyed. Tanya scoffed. They both stormed out a moment later. Later, Helen sat back down. Grace walked over, eyes wide. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," Helen replied. "That's why I did." In that moment, the room felt different. The customers who remained, old-timers, a couple truckers, Tina behind the counter, they looked at Grace like they saw her for the first time. Not as a rumor, not as a risk, but as someone worth defending. And maybe, just maybe, the whispers would start to fade. The storm hit sometime after midnight, sudden and angry. Thunder shook the roof above Grace's head like it was trying to wake the town. She didn't sleep. Her cot in the corner of the upstairs apartment remained untouched. Instead, she sat by the window, legs tucked against her chest, watching the rain streak down the glass. Her fingers moved restlessly over the old military ID in her lap, her uncle's, the edges worn soft like fabric. Staff Sergeant Samuel Blake. The name still meant something to her, more than just a ghost or a family tragedy. It was the first name she had ever traced with reverence, the first uniform she remembered feeling proud of, the first loss that didn't just leave a hole, but created a weight. Lightning illuminated the room in brief, breathless intervals. In one of them, Grace caught a glimpse of herself in the reflection. The lines around her eyes looked deeper. She looked older, not by years, but by something heavier, something time didn't measure. She didn't feel fear anymore. She felt inevitability. That whatever had been swirling around her since Helen walked through that door weeks ago, it was coming to the surface. Downstairs, the diner was dark and silent. But come morning, Grace would walk down those steps and face whatever else this town wanted to throw her way. This time, she wouldn't flinch. She was tired of flinching. By morning, the clouds had passed, and the town wore that post-storm hush that always followed a night of lightning and unrest. The air was still, streets slick with rain, as if everything had been reset, even if nothing had changed. Helen arrived just after the open sign was flipped. She wasn't wearing her leather jacket, just a soft blue flannel, the sleeves rolled to her elbows, her dog tags visible around her neck for the first time since she'd returned to Kingswood. Grace noticed immediately. Helen didn't sit at her usual spot. Instead, she walked to the back booth, the one that faced the entire diner. She nodded once, quietly. Grace understood. She poured 2 coffees and brought them over without a word. They sat in silence at first, sipping slowly. Then Helen reached into her bag and placed a small, leather-bound folder on the table. The corner was burned, and one strap had been resewn by hand. Grace recognized it, military issue. Helen opened it gently. Inside were photographs, some black and white, others faded by sand and sweat. Each was labeled on the back in blocky handwriting, name, rank, date. One in particular caught Grace's eye, a group photo. 12 soldiers, arms slung over each other's shoulders, dusty, laughing, young. She pointed. That's him. That's Sam. Helen nodded. That was our last full patrol before the mission changed. We were scheduled for recon and data recovery, just a basic sweep, but we were rerouted halfway through to support another team. Intel had picked up chatter about a possible weapons transfer near the mountains. Grace's fingers hovered over the photo but didn't touch. It was the day he didn't come back? She asked softly. Helen's jaw tightened. That was the day they stopped answering. She pulled another photo from beneath the folder. This one was a grainy satellite shot with red circles marked in pen. We were here, Helen said, pointing. Sam's squad split off and moved northeast to intercept. We were supposed to reconnect by 1800 hours, but we never heard from them again. Grace glanced at her. And you think that coordinate, the one you circled for me, was where they vanished? Helen looked tired now, not physically, but in her bones. I think something happened that night that was never meant to be found out. I think someone buried the story before we had the chance to ask the right questions. Grace sat back. And you think Sam might have... I think, Helen interrupted, that he died doing what we all did, holding the line, and then someone erased the line. They sat in stillness, the diner's hum around them like background noise to a truth neither had fully admitted until now. I always wondered, Grace said quietly, why they didn't send anything home except a folded flag. Not a letter, not a report, nothing that actually told us how he went. Helen's eyes softened. Because they didn't want to answer the questions that came with it? Grace's voice cracked. I was 12. I kept asking what happened. My mom just kept saying, he's gone. She couldn't even say the word dead. Helen reached across the table. Not to comfort, but to connect. I was there, she said. Not when he died, but in the blast zone, hours later. I saw the debris field. I saw things no one should have to see. But I didn't see Sam, and that's haunted me ever since. Grace stared at her. You think he was taken? Helen looked down. I think it's possible. And if he was, we'll never know. Too much time's passed. Too many people either lied or disappeared. Grace felt her throat tighten. So what do we do with that? Helen looked at her now, fully. We remember him, loudly. We tell the truth, even if it's too late to get answers. That afternoon, Helen called in a favor. She drove 2 hours out to a military base where an old friend, now a colonel, owed her one. She didn't ask for much, just access to an archived log, a printout of a convoy manifest, one that included the last GPS ping from Sam's unit. She left with a folder and a name of someone who might still be willing to talk. Grace, meanwhile, spent her day digging out the old tape recorder she kept in her bag, the one Sam had mailed her for her 13th birthday. She replaced the batteries and hit play. The tape was scratchy, but the voice that came through was unmistakable. "If you're listening, kid, you'd better be doing something amazing with your life, or at least eating pancakes. If not, stop this tape and go fix that. I'm serious. Life's short. I plan to spend mine getting home and giving you hell for turning into a teenager." Grace laughed, a full, aching sound. When Helen returned, she brought more than the folder. She brought an idea. "We're putting up a plaque," she said. Grace blinked. "What?" "A memorial for the 13th Recon. The real one. Not the names the government will read out on Veterans Day. The ones they don't talk about. The ones they forgot." Grace stared at her. "And if they ask who gave us permission?" Helen's smile was faint, but fierce. "They're already too late." By nightfall, they had made a list of names. 12 in total. Each one carved into the wood by Helen's hand, using her old engraving set from the garage. When they hung it in the diner the next day, the town noticed. Charlie was the first to salute it. Then came Tina, setting down a small vase of fresh flowers beneath it. Even Deputy Keener stood there, hat in hand. No one asked where it came from. No one needed to. And as Grace looked at that wall, eyes misting, heart thudding, she realized that for the first time in a long while, her uncle wasn't just a memory hidden in a shoebox. He was a name, etched into wood, etched into silence, but no longer forgotten. The morning air carried a kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. It was subtle, like a room that had held silence too long and finally exhaled. Helen Cartwright stood at the edge of the diner's lot, arms crossed, watching the crowd gather one by one. Not a large group, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to prove that memory had weight, and weight could shift a town's heart, even if just slightly. The makeshift memorial they'd mounted on the diner's wall had drawn more attention than either she or Grace expected. Veterans from nearby counties, a couple of family members who recognized the names, a man who said he'd served with one of the other fallen and drove 6 hours just to see that someone still remembered. After 18 hours, Jessica remembered, and Grace. Grace stood just inside the doorway, a fresh pot of coffee in her hand, her other brushing nervously against the bracelet on her wrist, one she now wore freely above the tattoo. She didn't hide it anymore. The raven, the number 3, the thorns. It was all visible now, and no one whispered about it. Helen stepped up onto the small platform they'd arranged with Tina's help, 2 milk crates stacked under a modest flagpole out front. Her voice didn't rise high, but it didn't need to. When Helen Cartwright spoke, people leaned in to hear, as if her words were carried by the gravity of everything she'd survived. "These names," she said, nodding toward the wooden plaque beside the window, "don't just belong to uniforms. They belong to stories. People, sons, daughters, friends, people like Sam Blake, who didn't just serve. They stood for the person beside them, even when no one else would." She paused. Some of them never made it home. Some came back and were forgotten anyway. But they mattered. And we're not going to let the silence write the ending anymore. There was no applause, just stillness, reverent and real. That was better than any clapping. Charlie Bennett stepped forward first. Vietnam vet, cantankerous soul with a gravelly voice and a limp. He raised his hand in salute, held it there, and gave one curt nod before turning away, eyes glassy. Others followed. Some left flowers. A few left challenge coins. One woman knelt and prayed. Inside the diner, Grace refilled mugs and offered smiles that came easier now. She moved with a sense of ease that hadn't been there when she first arrived, when she kept her sleeves long and her head low. She caught Helen's eye from across the room and smiled, a quiet understanding passing between them like a signal flare in the dark. Later, After the crowd thinned and only the regulars remained, Helen took her old stool, third from the left, facing the mirror. Charlie dropped into his spot beside her, the newspaper folded under his arm. "Well," he said, pouring sugar into his mug. "Never thought I'd live to see a waitress change the tone of an entire town." Helen smirked. "She didn't change it, she just reminded it." "Of what?" "That respect still has a place, if you've got the spine to stand for it." Charlie grunted, clearly impressed but trying not to show it. Grace walked over, setting down a fresh pot and topping off their cups. She lingered a second longer than usual. "Do you ever think they knew?" she asked. Helen looked up. "Who?" "The others, the ones who never made it back. You ever think they knew that someone would still be talking about them one day?" Helen studied her for a moment, then set down her cup. They didn't care about that. Not in the moment. They weren't fighting for medals or ceremonies. They were fighting to make sure the person next to them got home. She paused, voice softening. "And today I think they'd be damn proud that someone still gives a damn." Grace nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. There were no words for the ache that softened but never left. That part remained. But now it lived beside something else, something lighter. Purpose, maybe, or simply the knowledge that even scars could mean something when shared. That night, as dusk fell and the lights flickered on over the booths, Helen stepped behind the counter for the first time. Tina had gone home early. The younger staff had clocked out. It was just her and Grace, closing up shop. Helen washed dishes. Grace wiped tables. It was quiet, but not the heavy kind anymore. This silence was companionable, restful. It made space instead of taking it away. Grace leaned on the counter, arms crossed, hair tied up in a loose bun. She looked over at Helen with something like peace. "You staying in town?" she asked. Helen glanced up. "Thinking about it." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Thought you were just passing through." "I was," Helen said, rinsing a plate. "But sometimes you find something worth sticking around for." Grace smiled. "Besides," Helen added, "somebody's got to make sure you don't start any fights with motor mouths like Ricky Lane." Grace chuckled. "Please, you'd miss me if I did." Helen gave a small shrug. "Maybe." Grace stepped forward, pulled something from her back pocket, and handed it to Helen. It was one of Sam's letters, folded, slightly torn but still legible. On the back, written in a young girl's handwriting, were the words, "He saved you. Now you saved me. That makes us even." Helen looked at it for a long time, then tucked it into her flannel pocket with a nod. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. Instead, she walked to the front door, flipped the open sign to closed, and locked it for the night. On the way back, she paused beside the plaque. Her fingers grazed the names, Sam's especially. Then she whispered, "Rest easy, soldier. We've got it from here." Outside, the wind stirred the flags lining the curb. And in the diner that had once been filled with whispers, the only thing that remained was the smell of fresh coffee, the warmth of quiet resilience, and the kind of silence that doesn't bury the past, but honors it.